Dawn broke over the Marchfeld plain on July 5, 1809, revealing something unprecedented in military history. 320,000 men stood in formation across a flat Austrian landscape northeast of Vienna. 170,000 French soldiers under Napoleon Bonaparte faced 150,000 Austrians commanded by Archduke Charles. This would be the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars to date, a two-day collision that would showcase both Napoleon's tactical genius at its peak and the first signs that his invincibility was becoming mortal. In the next 48 hours, concentrated artillery fire would reach levels never before seen in warfare, and 90,000 casualties would prove that even victories could bleed an empire dry. To understand Wagram's significance, you need to grasp Austria's determination in 1809. This was their fourth war against Napoleon in 14 years. They'd been crushed at Austerlitz in 1805, humiliated in the subsequent peace treaty, and forced to watch Napoleon dominate Europe. But Austria hadn't been idle during those years. Archduke Charles, Emperor Francis I's brother, had spent 4 years completely reforming the Austrian military. He'd studied Napoleon's methods, copied what worked, improved what was weak, and created an Austrian army that finally matched French tactical sophistication. The proof had come just 6 weeks earlier at Aspern-Essling, where Archduke Charles had achieved the impossible. He'd defeated Napoleon in open battle. It was Napoleon's first major tactical defeat in a decade. French casualties exceeded 23,000, including Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's oldest friends who died from cannonball wounds. The emperor had been forced to retreat across the Danube, bloodied and humiliated. That defeat hung over the coming battle like a shadow. Napoleon needed to restore his reputation. Charles needed to prove Aspern-Essling wasn't luck. The Marchfeld plain was perfect terrain for the massive armies both commanders would deploy. Flat, open farmland with scattered villages offered excellent ground for artillery, cavalry, and the massive infantry formations both sides favored. The Danube River lay to the south, Vienna to the southwest. Napoleon had spent weeks after Aspern-Essling preparing for this rematch, building bridges, concentrating forces, planning the decisive blow that would end Austria's resistance once and for all. Napoleon's 170,000 men represented the Grande Armée at near-peak strength. Marshal Davout commanded the right wing with his excellent Third Corps. Marshal Massena, the old fox of war, held the left with First Corps. Marshal Oudinot, Bernadotte, Marmont, and others commanded the center and reserves. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, stood ready for the decisive moment. But Napoleon's secret weapon wasn't his marshals or his veterans. It was 112 artillery pieces he was planning to concentrate into the largest bombardment yet seen in warfare, the Grande Batterie. Facing this juggernaut was Archduke Charles with 150,000 Austrians. Charles was 38, the same generation as Napoleon, and Austria's most talented commander ever. Unlike previous Austrian generals who'd fought Napoleon using outdated linear tactics, Charles had reformed the Austrian army along French lines. His soldiers fought in columns and lines depending on circumstances. His officers showed initiative. His army moved faster, hit harder, and was motivated by genuine nationalist fervor, rather than just obedience to the emperor. This story reaches you in English, the language connecting military history from West Point to Sandhurst, from the war colleges of Canberra to the staff schools of New Delhi. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you watching this? Every military tradition has grappled with the balance between firepower and maneuver, between old methods and innovation. That's why Wagram still resonates. The scale of what was about to unfold was staggering. 320,000 men, roughly equal to the entire population of a major city in 1809, were about to collide in combat. Over 500 artillery pieces would thunder across the Marchfeld. Tens of thousands of cavalry would clash in charges that shook the earth. The wounded would number in the tens of thousands. The dead would carpet the fields. And all of it would happen in just 48 hours. Napoleon's strategy was characteristically aggressive. He'd attack the Austrian left wing with Davout while pinning their center and right with the rest of his army. Once Davout broke through, he'd wheel inward and roll up the Austrian line from the flank. It was the same maneuver that had worked at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland. But this time, he faced an opponent who'd studied those battles and knew what was coming. As the sun climbed higher on July 5th, both armies made final preparations. Soldiers checked their muskets, artillerymen positioned their guns, cavalry mounted their horses. 320,000 men were about to begin the largest battle Napoleon had yet fought, and what Austria didn't know was that Napoleon was about to demonstrate artillery firepower on a scale that would change warfare forever. On the French side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, 39 years old, Emperor of France and master of continental Europe. In 17 years, he'd risen from Corsican artillery officer to ruler of an empire stretching from Spain to Poland. He'd won Austerlitz, Jena Auerstedt, Friedland, and a dozen other battles that had rewritten the map of Europe. His Grande Armée was the most professional military force on the continent, hardened by years of continuous campaigning. But the recent defeat at Aspern-Essling had shaken his aura of invincibility. He needed Wagram to prove that loss was an aberration, not a trend. Napoleon's 170,000 men represented quality as much as quantity. These weren't raw conscripts, but veterans of multiple campaigns. His marshals were the best military commanders of their generation. Davout, the Iron Marshal, commanded the right wing with his superbly trained the Third Corps. Masséna, 51 years old but still deadly, held the left. Oudinot, Bernadotte, and Marmont commanded the center corps. Behind them all stood the Imperial Guard, 15,000 elite soldiers who'd never been defeated. These were men who'd marched from Moscow to Madrid, who trusted Napoleon absolutely because he'd delivered victory after victory. But Napoleon's true innovation for Wagram was artillery. He'd spent weeks preparing his masterpiece, the Grande Batterie, 112 cannon concentrated under one command. This wasn't just artillery support, it was artillery as the main weapon. Napoleon planned to use these guns to physically smash holes in the Austrian line through sheer weight of fire. No army had ever deployed such concentrated firepower. It was a gamble that would either revolutionize warfare or waste ammunition to no effect. Facing Napoleon was Archduke Charles of Austria, 38 years old, and the only commander alive who'd beaten Napoleon in open battle. Charles wasn't just a general, he was a reformer who'd spent 4 years rebuilding the Austrian military from its foundations. After the disaster at Austerlitz in 1805, he'd been given unprecedented authority to modernize Austria's army. He'd copied French tactical innovations, improved officer training, created a reserve system, and most importantly, inspired nationalist motivation, rather than relying solely on imperial obedience. Charles's 150,000 Austrians were a different breed from the army Napoleon had crushed at Austerlitz 4 years earlier. Austrian soldiers now fought in flexible formations, could maneuver rapidly, and showed initiative at lower command levels. Their artillery was excellent, their cavalry superb. Most importantly, they believed they could win. Aspern-Essling had proven Napoleon could bleed. If he could bleed, he could die. This psychological shift was perhaps Charles's greatest achievement, convincing Austrian soldiers they weren't facing a demigod, but just a very good general. If this story of history's largest Napoleonic battle, of 320,000 men colliding in 48 hours of unprecedented violence, is gripping you, then subscribe to Unfinished Battles and smash that like button right now. Because what happens when Napoleon deploys 112 guns in the largest artillery bombardment, yet scene will change how armies think about firepower forever. This isn't just history, it's the moment warfare evolved from maneuver to firepower dominance. The strategic situation made Wagram inevitable. After Aspern-Essling, Napoleon had retreated across the Danube to Lobau Island. For 6 weeks, he'd built bridges, concentrated forces, and prepared for a rematch. Charles had used that time to fortify positions on the Marchfeld plain and prepare defensive lines. Both commanders knew another battle was coming. Both spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. The difference was Napoleon had the initiative and Charles had the defensive advantage. The force composition told stories about both armies' evolution. Napoleon's Grande Armée included significant numbers of German, Italian, and Polish troops, alongside French soldiers. It was truly imperial, drawing on resources from across Europe. Charles's army was more homogeneous, predominantly German-speaking Austrians and Hungarians, but united by genuine nationalist fervor rather than just imperial command. Both armies had improved dramatically since their last meeting at Austerlitz. The question was, who'd improved more? Technology and tactics had both evolved by 1809. The smoothbore musket still ruled infantry combat, effective to maybe 100 yards. Artillery had become more mobile, using lighter carriages and better trained crews. Cavalry still played crucial roles in reconnaissance, shock action, and pursuit. But the real evolution was organizational. Core systems allowing independent maneuver, combined arms tactics integrating infantry, cavalry, artillery, and artillery concentration for decisive effect. Both Napoleon and Charles understood these principles. Wagram would determine who'd mastered them better. The psychological stakes were enormous. For Napoleon, another defeat would shatter his aura and potentially trigger rebellions across his empire. For Austria, another loss would end their resistance and confirm French dominance for the foreseeable future. For both commanders personally, this was about legacy. Napoleon needed to prove Aspern-Essling was aberration. Charles needed to prove it was the future. As July 5th dawned and both armies deployed across the Marchfeld plain, the contrast was stark. Napoleon's forces moved with practiced efficiency, corps deploying to predetermined positions. Charles's Austrians showed similar professionalism, a far cry from the confused masses at Austerlitz. Both sides were ready. The largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars was about to begin. At 4:00 a.m. on July 5th, as pre-dawn darkness still covered the Marchfeld plain, Napoleon gave the order. French artillery opened fire, and the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars exploded into violence. Marshal Massena's I Corps and Marshal Oudinot's II Corps launched the main assault against the Austrian left wing, attacking the villages of Aderklaa, Deutsch Wagram, and Baumersdorf. Napoleon's plan was straightforward: smash the Austrian left, then wheel inward to roll up their entire line. It was classic Napoleonic strategy. But Archduke Charles had studied those tactics for 4 years and was ready. The fighting for the villages was instantly brutal. These weren't open field maneuvers, but vicious close-quarters combat in narrow streets and fortified buildings. Austrian infantry, fighting with a determination Napoleon hadn't seen from them before, contested every house, every wall, every inch. Massena's veterans, accustomed to Austrian collapse, found themselves in grinding attritional warfare. Aderklaa changed hands 3 times in the first 4 hours. Each French advance was met by coordinated Austrian counterattacks. This wasn't the Austria of Austerlitz. By mid-morning, the scale of resistance became clear. Charles wasn't just defending, he was coordinating offensive actions. When French forces concentrated against one position, Austrian artillery would open devastating flanking fire. When French infantry seized a village, Austrian grenadiers would counterattack before the French could consolidate. Charles had positioned reserves perfectly, feeding them into threatened sectors with timing that frustrated every French breakthrough attempt. Napoleon, watching from his command post, realized he was facing the best commanded Austrian army he'd ever encountered. On the French right wing, Marshal Davout began his methodical advance against the Austrian left. Davout was Napoleon's most reliable subordinate, and his Third Corps was the Grande Armée's finest. He advanced with characteristic caution, using artillery to soften positions before infantry assaulted, coordinating combined arms attacks that slowly pushed the Austrians back. But even Davout's excellence couldn't achieve rapid breakthrough. The Austrians bent but didn't break, retreating to prepared fallback positions, making the French pay for every yard. The center of the battlefield became a massive artillery duel. French and Austrian guns traded fire across the Marchfeld plain, creating a thunderous roar that could be heard in Vienna 15 miles away. Soldiers on both sides described the sound as continuous thunder, without pause, shells screaming overhead and exploding in fountains of dirt and body parts. The smoke became so thick that commanders lost visual contact with their own units. Officers rode through the haze trying to locate their men, sometimes ending up in enemy lines by accident. By early afternoon, casualties were mounting horrifically on both sides. The French had made gains, pushing the Austrians back from some villages, but nowhere had they achieved the decisive breakthrough Napoleon needed. Austrian morale remained high despite losses. Charles rode among his troops, visible in his white uniform, inspiring continued resistance. His calm presence under fire steadied units that might otherwise have broken. This was leadership Napoleon recognized and respected, even as it frustrated his plans. The late afternoon saw renewed French efforts. Napoleon committed more reserves, throwing additional infantry into the village fighting. Oudinot was wounded, leading an assault, temporarily disrupting the Toncourt command. Still, the Austrians held. Charles's defensive system was working perfectly. Absorb the French attack, counterattack when possible, trade space for time, and bleed the French for every position. The Austrians were fighting smarter than Napoleon had ever seen them fight. As the sun set on July 5th, both armies remained locked in combat, but the fighting gradually died down from exhaustion. Soldiers collapsed where they stood, too tired to dig proper defensive positions. The wounded crawled or lay where they'd fallen, crying for water, for medics, for death. The cost of day one was staggering, approximately 40,000 casualties total, split relatively evenly between French and Austrian forces. Neither army had broken, neither had achieved decisive advantage. Napoleon surveyed the battlefield in growing frustration. He'd committed 170,000 men and achieved what? Some villages captured, some ground gained, but the Austrian army remained intact and defiant. Charles had proven Aspern-Essling wasn't luck. The Austrian army had genuinely evolved to match French capabilities. Tomorrow would require something different, something the Austrians hadn't seen, something that would overwhelm their defensive excellence through sheer firepower. Tomorrow would belong to the Grande Batterie. Dawn on July 6th revealed exhausted armies stirring across the Marchfeld plain. 40,000 casualties from day one lay scattered across the battlefield, many still alive and crying for help. But Napoleon had no time for mercy. During the night, he'd made a decision that would change warfare forever. He ordered 112 artillery pieces concentrated into a single massive battery positioned in the center of his line. No commander in history had ever assembled such concentrated firepower. What was about to happen would demonstrate that enough guns firing together could break any defensive position, no matter how well commanded. The Grande Batterie took hours to position properly. Artillery crews worked through the night and early morning, hauling guns into precise formations, stockpiling ammunition, calculating firing angles. General Davout, Napoleon's artillery commander, personally supervised the placement of each gun. The battery formed a line over 1,000 yards long, guns almost wheel to wheel, all aimed at the Austrian center. When Archduke Charles's scouts reported this concentration, some Austrian officers dismissed it as impossible. 112 guns. The ammunition consumption alone would be astronomical. But Napoleon had spent 6 weeks stockpiling shells on Lobau Island. He had the ammunition. The question was whether it would work. At 9 a.m., Napoleon gave the signal. 112 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was beyond anything soldiers on either side had experienced. Witnesses described the earth shaking, buildings collapsing in nearby villages from the concussion alone. The smoke formed a wall so thick that gunners fired blind, reloading and firing by rhythm rather than sight. Each gun fired roughly 2 shots per minute. That meant 224 cannonballs per minute, over 13,000 per hour, screaming into the Austrian center. The effect on Austrian formations was catastrophic. Cannonballs tore through tight infantry formations, each ball killing or wounding multiple men. Shells exploded overhead, showering soldiers with shrapnel. Austrian artillery tried returning fire but couldn't match the concentrated French barrage. Austrian infantry, which had stood firm against attacks all day yesterday, began wavering under the relentless bombardment. Men couldn't stand motionless while iron death rained down. Units started backing away, then retreating, then breaking. While the Grande Batterie shattered the Austrian center, Davout exploited the chaos on the right wing. His III Corps, always the Grande Armée's best, attacked with coordinated precision. French infantry advanced behind artillery support, cavalry screened the flanks, and when Austrian counterattacks came, Davout's guns cut them down at range. By mid-morning, Davout had achieved what Napoleon needed, a genuine breakthrough on the Austrian left. Austrian units there began retreating in disorder, exposing the flank of Charles's center. Napoleon then unleashed his most controversial tactic of the battle. General MacDonald led a massive column of 8,000 infantry directly at the Austrian center, formed in a hollow square for mutual support. This dense formation was the artillery crew's dream target, and Austrian guns savaged it mercilessly. MacDonald's column suffered over 40% casualties in the advance. But the survivors, supported by the Grande Batterie's ongoing bombardment, smashed into the already weakened Austrian center and broke through. By early afternoon, Archduke Charles faced the reality Napoleon had imposed through firepower. His army was breaking. The left wing was collapsing under Davout's assault. The center was shattered by artillery and MacDonald's penetration. Only the right wing remained intact. Charles, demonstrating the same excellence he'd shown all battle, made the hard decision. He ordered general retreat. But unlike so many armies Napoleon had broken, the Austrian withdrawal was organized. Rearguards fought skillfully, cavalry screened the retreat, and the army pulled back in relatively good order toward Bohemia. Napoleon launched pursuit, but his army was as exhausted as the Austrians. 2 days of continuous combat had drained French forces. Cavalry charges captured some Austrian stragglers and artillery, but there was no devastating pursuit like after Austerlitz or Jena. The Austrian army survived, bloodied, but not destroyed. Still, the result was clear. Napoleon had won. The Grande Batterie had proven that concentrated artillery could break defensive positions through sheer firepower. The casualty count was horrific. French losses approached 40,000 over 2 days. Austrian casualties exceeded 50,000. Combined, over 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 48 hours. The Marchfeld plain was carpeted with bodies. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded. The cost of victory had been astronomical. Napoleon had won, but the margin was narrower and bloodier than any of his previous triumphs. The immediate aftermath of Wagram was Austria's capitulation. Archduke Charles, despite conducting a masterful retreat, couldn't overcome the political reality. His army was shattered, Vienna was occupied, and continuing the war would only bring more destruction. Within months, Austria sued for peace. The Treaty of Schönbrunn in October 1809 was harsh. Austria lost over 3.5 million subjects, ceded significant territories to France and its allies, paid enormous indemnities, and was forced to join Napoleon's continental system against Britain. The Fourth Coalition War ended with French dominance reaffirmed. But Wagram's true significance wasn't territorial, it was tactical. The Grande Batterie had demonstrated something revolutionary. Concentrated artillery firepower could break defensive positions that infantry and cavalry couldn't penetrate. Napoleon had assembled 112 guns and used them not as support weapons but as the main arm of decision. The sustained bombardment on July 6th physically destroyed Austrian cohesion before French infantry even attacked. This was firepower dominance in its earliest form, and every military establishment in Europe took notice. The artillery lesson spread rapidly. Within years, every major European army was experimenting with massed batteries, concentrating guns for decisive effect rather than distributing them evenly across the line. The Napoleonic War's later battles saw increasingly large artillery concentrations. By the American Civil War 50 years later, artillery barrages involving hundreds of guns became standard. By World War I, artillery dominated battlefields so completely that infantry became almost secondary. The lineage traces directly back to Wagram's 112 guns. Yet Wagram also revealed Napoleon's vulnerability. 40,000 French casualties in 2 days was catastrophic. Napoleon had won, but barely. and only through firepower that required enormous logistical preparation he couldn't always replicate. The emperor who'd won Austerlitz with 1,300 casualties and Jena Auerstedt with 5,000 had needed 40,000 dead and wounded to defeat Austria at Wagram. The margin between victory and defeat was narrowing. His enemies were learning, adapting, improving. The aura of invincibility was fading into mere superiority. Archduke Charles's performance deserves historical recognition beyond what it typically receives. He took an army that had been crushed repeatedly and reformed it into a force that made Napoleon bleed for every yard. He'd beaten Napoleon at Aspern-Essling and nearly fought him to a draw at Wagram despite being outnumbered. His defensive coordination on July 5th frustrated every French breakthrough attempt. His organized retreat on July 6th saved his army from destruction. He was the template for the commanders who would eventually defeat Napoleon. Learn from him, copy what works, and force him to pay in blood for victories. Modern military academies worldwide study Wagram as a case study in artillery concentration and its effects. The Grande Batterie demonstrated principles still taught today. Mass firepower at decisive points, sustain bombardment to achieve psychological and physical destruction, exploit the chaos created by fires with maneuver forces. The U.S. Army's Field Artillery Branch traces its doctrinal roots partially to Wagram's lessons. The concept of fires as a combat multiplier begins here with Napoleon's 112 guns. The scale alone makes Wagram historically significant. 320,000 men engaged across 2 days, over 90,000 casualties, 500 artillery pieces firing tens of thousands of rounds, dozens of cavalry charges involving thousands of horsemen. It was industrial-scale warfare before the Industrial Age, showcasing both the terrible efficiency of Napoleonic military systems and their human cost. The romanticized image of Napoleonic warfare dies at Wagram, replaced by the reality of mass slaughter through firepower. The battle's timing in 1809 marked the beginning of Napoleon's decline. He'd win again at Dresden in 1813, but Wagram was his last great offensive victory won through tactical brilliance. After this, he'd fight increasingly defensive campaigns against coalitions that had learned his methods. The student armies he'd dominated were becoming peer competitors. The artillery revolution he'd pioneered would eventually be used against him. If this story of history's largest Napoleonic battle, of how 112 guns changed warfare forever, of how victory became pyrrhic even in triumph, has moved you, subscribe to Unfinished Battles, hit that like button, and comment telling me which country you're watching from and which artillery battles shaped your nation's history. Firepower has dominated warfare for 2 centuries since Wagram. Share the stories of how it changed your military tradition. In 48 hours and 112 guns, Napoleon proved that concentrated firepower could crush even the best reformed enemies. But the 40,000 French corpses carpeting the Marchfeld showed the emperor was no longer the invincible genius of Austerlitz, just the most dangerous general of a dangerous age. The artillery revolution had begun, and it would eventually consume its creator.